They promised us the full story. Every textbook, every documentary, every history teacher standing at the front of the classroom, swearing they're giving us the facts. But here's the thing nobody talks about. History isn't written by people who want you to know the truth. It's written by people who want you to believe their version of it. Think about it. When was the last time you heard about the losers of a war getting to tell their side? When was the last time a powerful government admitted they were completely wrong about something that happened decades ago? The answer is almost never. And that's not an accident. Today we're diving into some of the biggest historical events that everyone thinks they know the complete story about, except they don't. Because what we've been told is carefully edited, sometimes straight up false, and often leaves out the most important parts. The parts that would make us question everything we thought we knew. Let's start with something you definitely learned in school. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. That's what they taught us, right? Columbus was this brave explorer who sailed across the ocean and found a new world. They even gave us a holiday for it. But here's what they conveniently left out of that story. Fiercest of all, you can't discover a place where millions of people already live. That's like me walking into your house and saying, I discovered your living room. The Americas had somewhere between 50 to 100 million people living there before Columbus showed up. They had cities, governments, trade routes, agriculture, and complex societies. But that part gets skipped over, because it doesn't fit the narrative of Europeans bringing civilization to an empty wilderness. And Columbus himself. The guy was brutal. We're talking forced labor, torture, and mass murder of indigenous people. His own men wrote about how horrified they were by his treatment of the native population. The Spanish monarchs actually arrested him and brought him back in chains because his cruelty was too much, even by their standards. But that's not in the elementary school version, is it? Here's another one. The pyramids of Egypt. We're told they were built by slaves, right? Tens of thousands of slaves dragging massive stones across the desert under the whip of cruel pharaohs. It's a powerful image. It's also completely wrong. Archaeologists have found the workers' villages near the pyramids. These weren't slave quarters. They were communities where skilled laborers lived with their families. They had health care, they got pade, they were buried with honor near the pyramids they helped build. We've found records of sick days and worker strikes. You know what slaves don't do? Go on strike and negotiate for better working conditions. But the slave narrative stuck around for centuries because it made better stories. It gave movies a villain. It made the pyramids seem even more impressive. Look what people can accomplish with enough cruelty. Except that's not what happened. The pyramids were built by organized labor, engineering knowledge, and a society that valued these massive projects enough to invest resources in the people making them. Now let's talk about something more recent. The Cold War. You know the story. Democracy versus communism. Freedom versus oppression. The United States standing up for liberty around the world, while the Soviet Union spread totalitarian control. That's the version most of us grew up with. But here's what they didn't mention in those history classes. The United States overthrew democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and dozens of other countries during the Cold War. Not dictatorships, democracies. Governments that people actually voted for. Why? Because those governments wanted to nationalize their resources or implement policies that American corporations didn't like. In 1953, Iran had a democratic government under Prime Minister Mohammad. He wanted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, so the profits would go to Iranian people instead of British and American oil companies. So the CIA organized a coup, overthrew him, and installed a dictator who would play ball. That dictator ruled for 25 years with brutal secret police and zero democracy. But we were the good guys, remember? Or look at Guatemala in 1954. They elected a president who wanted land reform so poor farmers could own land instead of it all belonging to the United Fruit Company, an American corporation. The CIA overthrew that government too. The dictatorships that followed killed over 200,000 people. But that's not part of the freedom and democracy narrative we hear about. Here's something that'll make you question everything. The war on drugs? You've heard it a million times. Drugs are bad. Drugs destroy communities. we need harsh laws to protect society. Nixon started the war on drugs in the 1970s because he cared about public health and safety, right? Wrong. One of Nixon's top advisors, John Ehrlichman, admitted years later what the war on drugs was really about, and I'm not making this up. This is a direct quote. He said they couldn't make it illegal to be against the war in Vietnam or to be black, but they could associate hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, then criminalize both heavily. They could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them on the news. That was the actual goal. It wasn't about protecting anyone. It was about targeting political enemies and minority communities, and it worked. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world now. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. And a huge chunk of those people are there for nonviolent drug offenses. Let's go back further. The Middle Ages. You probably think of it as the Dark Ages, right? 1,000 years of ignorance, superstition, filth, and people dying of plague while the Catholic Church controlled everything and burned scientists at the stake. That's the image we all have, except historians don't even call it the Dark Ages anymore because that name is based on propaganda from later periods. The Renaissance writers wanted to make themselves look better, so they painted the previous era as dark and backwards. But the reality is way more complicated. The medieval period had universities, hospitals, and legal systems. They made massive advances in agriculture, architecture, and engineering. Those Gothic cathedrals everyone admires, medieval engineers built those without modern technology. They had complex water systems, banking, international trade networks, and philosophers debating everything from politics to science. Were there problems? Obviously, every era has problems. But it wasn't this 1,000-year stretch of everyone being stupid and miserable. That's just the story that people who came later wanted to tell about it. Here's one that might surprise you. Vikings. What do you picture when you think of Vikings? Bloodthirsty raiders with horned helmets, pillaging villages, and burning everything in sight. That image is about 50% accurate at best. First off, Vikings never wore horned helmets. That was made up by costume designers in the 1800s. It looked cool, so it stuck around, but there's zero archaeological evidence for it. Second, most Vikings weren't raiders at all. They were farmers, traders, and craftspeople who lived pretty normal lives. Yes, some Vikings went on raids, but Viking societies also had complex legal systems, democratic assemblies, and women who could own property and divorce their husbands. They were master shipbuilders and navigators who reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They established trade routes from Baghdad to Greenland, but we reduced them to one-dimensional barbarians, because that's easier to put in a movie. Let's talk about something really uncomfortable. World War II. Now before you click away, hear me out. Obviously, the Nazis were evil. Obviously, the Holocaust was one of humanity's greatest crimes. That's not what I'm questioning. What I'm questioning is the simplified narrative of who the good guys were and what they knew. American companies did business with Nazi Germany well into the war. IBM provided the punch card systems that helped organize the Holocaust. Ford and General Motors built trucks for the German military. American banks financed German industry, but that's rarely mentioned because it complicates the clean narrative of good versus evil and the Holocaust itself. We're told nobody knew what was happening until Allied troops liberated the camps. That's false. The Allies knew. They had detailed reports about the death camps as early as 1942. Jewish organizations begged them to bomb the railways leading to Auschwitz or the camp itself. Ils refusaient. They said it wasn't a military priority. After the war, the United States recruited Nazi scientists and intelligence officers through Operation Paperclip. Some of these people had directly participated in war crimes, but they had knowledge about rockets and the Soviet Union, so we gave them new identities and jobs. The moral clarity gets pretty muddy when you look at the details. Here's something that affects all of us right now. The food pyramid. You know, that nutrition guy that told us to eat tons of bread and pasta and go easy on fats. Millions of people base their diets on that thing. Schools taught it. Doctors recommended it. It was official government nutrition advice. It was also heavily influenced by the sugar industry and grain producers. Documents that came out decades later showed that sugar companies paid scientists to downplay the risks of sugar and blame fat for heart disease instead. The government listened to these industry-funded studies, and an entire generation ate according to guidelines that were shaped by corporate profits rather than actual nutrition science. And now we're dealing with obesity and diabetes epidemics that can be traced partly back to that flawed advice. But the people who created those guidelines aren't held accountable. The system just quietly updates its recommendations and moves on. Let's go way back. The Library of Alexandria. You've heard about this. The greatest library in the ancient world, containing all human knowledge, burned down in one catastrophic fire. Centuries of learning lost in a single tragic accident. Except that's not what happened either. The Library of Alexandria declined over centuries. It had multiple fires, budget cuts, changing political priorities, and gradual neglect. There was no single dramatic burning. But a tragic story of one huge fire is more memorable than the boring reality of institutional decline and So that's the version that survived. This pattern happens over and over. We take complex historical events and simplify them into stories that are easier to remember and more emotionally satisfying. But in that simplification, we lose the truth. Let's talk about diamonds. You probably think diamonds are rare and valuable, right? That's why engagement rings are supposed to have diamonds. It's tradition. It shows you really care because you spent a lot of money. Except none of that is true. Diamonds aren't rare. The De Beers Company controlled the diamond supply for most of the 20th century and deliberately kept production low to maintain high prices. They created the entire concept of diamond engagement rings through marketing campaigns starting in the 1930s. Before that, engagement rings didn't have to have diamonds. The famous slogan, "A diamond is forever," was invented by an advertising agency in 1947. They ran campaigns telling men they had to spend 2 months' salary on a ring. They got movies to show diamond rings. They convinced everyone this was ancient tradition when it was actually corporate marketing. And it worked so well that most people still think diamond engagement rings are some timeless romantic necessity. Here's one more. Thanksgiving. The story you learned in elementary school about pilgrims and Native Americans sitting down for a friendly harvest feast together. They shared food. Everyone got along. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship between cultures. That's a nice story for kids. It's also sanitized to the point of being fiction. The Wampanoag. People who attended that feast were there because of a political alliance, not friendship. They were dealing with disease epidemics that had killed huge portions of their population, and they needed allies against rival tribes. Within a generation, the descendants of those same pilgrims were fighting wars against Native Americans and taking their land. The modern Thanksgiving holiday wasn't even established to commemorate that feast. Lincoln created it during the Civil War as a way to unite the country. But the Pilgrim story got attached to it later because it was more pleasant than talking about the actual history of European colonization and Native American genocide. So what's the point of all this? Why does it matter if the stories we tell about history aren't completely accurate? Because the stories we believe about the past shape how we think about the present. If we think Columbus discovered America, we're accepting the idea that European arrival was the beginning of American history and everything before that doesn't count. If we think the war on drugs is about public health, we don't question why it targets certain communities more than others. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to decide what happened and how we remember it. And the people with power get to shape those memories to justify their power. Kings commission histories that make them look noble. Governments write textbooks that make their wars look righteous. Corporations fund research that supports their products. The truth is usually more complicated, more uncomfortable, and less satisfying than the stories we tell. But it's also more important, because when we accept simplified versions of history, we're accepting someone else's agenda. We're letting them control not just how we see the past, but how we understand the world we live in right now. Every time you hear a historical fact presented as simple and obvious, ask yourself, who benefits from this version of the story? What are they leaving out? Who isn't getting to tell their side? The answers to those questions will tell you a lot more than the official version ever will. They promise to reveal the truth, but what they're actually hiding is that truth is almost never simple, almost never clean, and almost never fits the narrative that powerful people want you to believe. The real story is always more complex, and that complexity, that messiness, that's where the actual truth lives. If this made you think differently about history, hit subscribe for more videos that question what we think we know.